survived. He's on his way back. And he has that question. What was this all about that we did? A couple other people that weren't here, I don't think, when I introduced people before. David Baring, who was on the War Comes Home Committee. Thank you for your time and efforts, David. Bob Seda, who without Bob and Donna, we wouldn't have a lot of the things that are in the Veterans Memorial Building collection to be able to use. So, Bob, thank you. And I would like to introduce to you the American perspective on World War I. John Futini is our next speaker. John has taught U.S. history and Western American history. He has taught at Indian Valley College, Chapman College, now Chapman University, and Napa Valley College. John is amazingly enthusiastic. I started talking to John about 6 or 7 months ago, I think, about this. And I have heard that he has been working diligently for 6 or 7 months. So I'm anxious to hear what he has to say. I got that piece of information from his lovely wife, Jamie, who's down here in front, who has basically put up with us for 6 or 7 months. So the American perspective, and by the way, we're actually keeping to time because we want to have some time for some questions afterwards. So that's kind of built into the program here. John Futini?
Good evening. Thank you for attending the American experience of World War I. This is the complimentary talk to the European experience in the war to end all wars, which the American people simply referred to as the European War, and once they got into it, they called it the World War. So that was the American, part of the American viewpoint on how it should be called. And going with the aid of PowerPoint here, just to talk about the Western Front. That yellow line separates France from Germany, Germany being the brown, France being the purple, Belgium the orange up at the top. That there was an assassination in Austria-Hungary in June of 1914, and there were all these alliance systems, and although the domino theory might not have held true for the Vietnamese War in Southeast Asia, it held true for World War I in Europe. There had been 99 years of peace. The concert of Europe, they called it, after old Napoleon Bonaparte had been finally exiled to the island of St. Helena in the North Atlantic Ocean. Each side of World War I was very mechanized, except that they had so many millions of troops that they couldn't outflank each other. The Germans came very close as the invaders to capturing Paris. Maybe if they had captured Paris, the French might have said, oh, c'est la vie, we're going to surrender, and that's it. But somehow the French managed to keep Paris safe, and each side tried to outflank each other from Switzerland, that little rose-colored country in the sort of the center of the map, all the way to the English Channel. There developed a deadlock. The troops entrenched, facing each other across no man's land. No man's land came from the 13th century Oxford English Dictionary. There had been, back in the days of yore, when knights were old and bold and all that, between the castles a dumping ground. The refuse was so bad, no one wanted to go there, so it was simply called no man's land. And that's where it came from, and it got reintroduced into the European War. In 2.5 years of charging across no man's land to seize the other side's trenches, millions of men on both sides, the British and the French versus the Germans, were lost, and the lines only bent back about 5 miles either way. It was a complete stalemate on the Western Front. Now, back in the good old
old US of A. President Woodrow Wilson, the 28th US president, a Democrat who had been elected in 1912 because the Republican Party was split between Theodore Roosevelt as a bull moose candidate and other Republican candidates, got in there and told Americans at the outbreak of the war in Europe in the summer of 1914 that they must remain neutral in thought as well as in act. Wilson had been a teacher, a history teacher, and he was viewing the American people as his class. So he was, in effect, saying, mind my instructions, don't get involved in this European entanglement, and besides, we have the great shield of the Monroe Doctrine from the 1820s when America said to Europe, hands off the Americas, this is a free zone where freedom will prevail. We don't want any European folly or influence in the Western Hemisphere. And so that particular symbol came out in the papers at that time. However, many Americans decided they couldn't stay over here when there was so much bedlam over there. The German armies had overrun neutral Belgium. Back in 1839, all the great European powers had signed the Treaty of Belgium. And that meant that Belgium was supposed to be inviolate. But the Kaiser, who led Germany, said, the treaty is really a meaningless scrap of paper. And so the Germans marched across Belgium and conquered the country. 7 million people fell under the German yoke. The German army was largely a foraging army. Germany was an industrial state more than an agricultural one. So to get more provender, they raided Belgium houses, Belgium farms. They milked Belgium dry. And so starving little Belgium caught the sympathy of a neutral America. How can we let this happen? The population was 652 people per square mile in Belgium. As an example, it was only 31 people per square mile in the United States of America, even though the frontier in America had closed in 1890. So Belgium needed some kind of relief. Herbert Hoover was an American mining engineer and geologist. He happened to be in Central Europe at the time of the outbreak of the Great War. He took matters into his own hands. He was a wealthy individual. He had mines all over the world, and with his wealth, he financed dozens and dozens of merchant ships to carry food from the good old US of A to ports on the northern European coast. He managed to persuade the British and the French to let him get his ships through, because they had, at the end of 1914, with the stalemate on the Western Front, this ironclad naval blockade. They didn't want American goods getting into Europe, getting into German hands, and fueling the German war machine. So these ships sailed across to show the German submarine force, Germany's main naval weapon, that they were neutral. They had great big banners on the sides of the ships. CRB, which meant Committee for the Relief of Belgium, and the Germans actually abided by it, and the ships were not sunk. And so the people of Belgium were fed. In addition, there were 2 million French people trapped behind German lines in northeastern France, where the German armies had made an initial breakthrough and were holding that part of France. Hoover, through his relief committee, which was staffed incidentally by American university students who withdrew from their studies to help save the starving of Europe, managed to preserve 9 million lives, and perhaps was the greatest American hero, either combatant or non-combatant, of the entire First World War. And of course, later a president who got blamed for the Great Depression by him. So there's irony in history, and that was one of them. Many other Americans said, I don't want to be a soldier in the British and French ranks, although 40,000 did volunteer just to do that. They said, I want to be an ambulance driver. They have ambulances with internal combustion engines in them. They can carry a couple of patients of mine, and if one patient is like a walking wounded, he can sit next to the ambulance driver. And we'll drive them back to aid stations behind the front line trenches. And so President Woodrow Wilson frowned upon these people as freaks. Most of them were, again, American university students from Harvard or Yale or Princeton or wherever, and they went overseas, donned military uniforms, but they were not soldiers. They were humanitarians of a different stripe. And of course, Ernest Hemingway perhaps is an archetype. The only thing is, according to the research, Hemingway apparently didn't drive an ambulance. He enlisted in the ambulance corps in Italy, which had joined the Allied cause in early 1915, primarily because the Italians wanted some real estate that Austria had held claim to. Mr. Hemingway was bored by the whole thing and said it was like being at a country club. He used the French word ennui, which means a vast, deep boredom, because between battles there was a vast amount of time, and all you did was sit behind the front, smoke cigars and cigarettes, and look at the birds chirping in the leaves of the trees or something. So he decided to take matters into his own hands one day. He got some chocolates, he got some cigarettes, he got some postcards of a Europe which supposedly was at peace, the Great Colosseum and other archetypal things that tourists would ogle. And he was bicycling them to Italian troops on the front. Well, he said what happened next reformed him out of the war. Suddenly there was a giant explosion and pieces of shrapnel entered his legs. He fell off the bicycle. Other people were wounded nearby. They were soldiers. One of them couldn't get up. It looked like he might die. Hemingway picked him up with his 2 shrapnel legs and carried him 200 yards back to an aid station. And while he's carrying him back, a German machine gun sounded off and put a couple more bullets in his legs for extra good measure. So Mr. Hemingway was confined to a hospital for several months in Milan, Italy, and Milan was well behind the Alpine front in northern Italy. Hemingway heard tales from other wounded soldiers, and he retained them in his excellent and well-organized mind, and when he got on a ship back to New York City, that's when he started writing such things as A Farewell to Arms and A Movable Feast. So this is part of the great literary tradition. It came from somebody that actually never drove an ambulance, even though he got into the ambulance. Norman Prince was a Harvard student who said, "The heck with book learning, I want to be a heroic knight of the sky." He went over with 5 other college students, and they formed what was called the American Lafayette Escadrille. But America was still neutral. Germany said this is a slap in the face, so they had to drop American, and it eventually simply became known as the Lafayette Escadrille. The 7th pilot was an American adventurer named Bert Hall, who had such a fantastic life, one to this day doesn't know if it was true or false, but Bert Hall was a darn good pilot, even though he was never a college student. And the same was in the Escadrille. One good pilot with a sure and steady aim, with a concentration over the controls of his warbird, is worth 100 pilots that are mediocre with university degrees. He's in front of a French SPAD. The American Air Service had 55 planes and 35 pilots. It wasn't fit for any kind of aerial combat in Europe. So the French provided the aircraft, but as a memento of home, an American Indian was emblazoned on the sides of the fuselages of the Escadrille, and eventually there were 300 pilots in this organization. So it picked up quite a few fine young men in in the process.
I also have the tech here.
Oh, it's like, oh, something happened here.
They didn't have this kind of technology back then. So. Oh, here we go. Perfect, perfect. The first African-American pilot in the Escadrille was Eugene Jacques Boulard, the Black Swallow of Death, his fellow pilots called him. He had been born on a tenant dirt farm in Mississippi State. The only thing he owned as a teenager was a pet goat. He decided he wanted to see the greater world, so he sold his beloved goat for $1.50, hopped a German freighter, and went across to Scotland initially. And he joined Mrs. Davis's Pickaninny show as an acrobat. And later, he took up some boxing. And so he was quite an interesting fellow. When war broke out in Europe, he had this romantic thought of joining the French Foreign Legion, because the French Foreign Legion didn't wear brown uniforms. They wore baggy red scarlet pants, a blue blouse with golden spangles, and some sort of a headdress similar to the Arab headdress of North Africa. And so he started as a machine gunner in the French Foreign Legion, but he quickly sickened of it. He said, every time that the sergeant in command of our machine gun section yelled "feu," which was French for fire, I opened up and I was killing German after German, but he said I didn't see them as the enemy. I began to see them as fathers, as husbands, as boyfriends, with children, with cousins, with perhaps even grandchildren, and nieces and nephews. And he said, I sickened so much of it, I didn't know what to do until I was wounded one day, and I was sent back into the environs of Paris to recuperate. And I talked to a couple of pilots from the Escadrille, and they said, you know, Eugene, we don't have any African-American pilots in the Escadrille. Have you ever thought about joining? And not only that, it pays more than being a lowly soldier in the French infantry. So he said, yes, I'm going to do it. He flew 20 combat missions, shot down a couple of German planes behind the lines, and survived the war. And afterwards, he decided to stay in France because he fell in love with a white French countess. You couldn't marry a white woman in America in the early 20th century if you were African American. So he stayed there, and when the Second German War started in Europe in 1940, he fought with the Resistance against the Nazis. He was badly wounded. He was spirited out of France to New York City, and didn't come back to France until 1954, when it was the 40th anniversary of the outbreak of World War I, to light the tomb of the unknown soldier below the Arc de Triomphe on the Champs-Élysées. So he was quite a romantic individual. It almost looks like a Hollywood.
Oh, no.
This
Go to the left corner.
left corner it is. Ah, yes. Thank you. Now, meanwhile, on the high seas, we're supposed to be still neutral. Americans loved sailing on luxury liners. They didn't have passenger airplanes back then that could traverse over the Atlantic. The Germans had announced in early 1915 to counter the cruel British blockade that was starving Germans. Hundreds of Germans were collapsing in the streets, civilians, not soldiers, behind the front, because the British blockade was so effective against getting foodstuffs into Germany by any maritime power, including the United States. The British were desperate for one thing at that point in the war. They had lots of artillery, they had lots of men, this was still early in the war, but they did not manufacture enough artillery, ammunition, and rifle ammunition. In the hold of the innocent-looking Lusitania passenger ship were 5 million rounds of American-manufactured Remington rifle ammunition, which just by coincidence happened to fit inside of the breech of British Enfield rifles, the standard piece in the British Army. How convenient. The captain was told, zigzag your ship, have your crew go through lifeboat drills. And he asked, why I, Master William Turner, who have so much experience on the high seas, They said because a U-boat could torpedo you. Now, there were only 7 German Unterseebooten on the high seas at that time. But one of them was along the route of the Lusitania. They fired one torpedo a half-mile away, and it struck the Lusitania. There was a loud explosion, and then there was a second explosion, a deeper rumble a few seconds afterwards. Was it the rifle rounds stored in the hull of the ship? Was it a fuel bunker that got ignited by the torpedo explosion? It still isn't well known. Now, this slide shows these perfectly harmonious passengers in well-ordered lifeboats, but actually it wasn't the case. The crew was so inept, the lifeboats and passengers were flipping upside down, the passengers were drowning underneath the lifeboats. There were 2,000 passengers and crew. The Lusitania went down in 300 feet of water in 18 minutes and took 1,300 with mostly innocent civilians, 128 of whom were Americans. President Wilson and the American people were shocked. How could such a brutal act be committed by Germany using this new weapon called the submarine? It seemed like America might enter the war at that point. Okay, there we go. Now, one of the passengers survived by hanging on to flotsam in the water. She was from Medford, Oregon, and she thought that the voyage was a dull, stupid affair until just moments later someone saw a wake of a torpedo in the water. And the ship was badly listing. She simply jumped over the side, grabbed onto a piece of flotsam, and British ships showed up fairly soon, and she was rescued. So she was so inspired, she went through an apotheosis and became a canteen girl serving doughboys and Allied troops on the Western Front. So that was her experience in the Lusitania sinking. The Lusitania was the sister ship, by the way, of the Titanic. And these ships were far from invincible on the high seas. Meanwhile, the following year, 1916, America is still neutral. In the summer of 1916, beautiful day, suddenly in Chesapeake Bay, a periscope broke the waves, and it was the periscope of a German submarine. The Deutschland. She was a huge submarine, longer than most of the U-boats. But with one key difference, she was a mercantile submarine, not a combat sub. She had many goods inside of her hold to peacefully trade with the Americans. Her voyage was totally unannounced. There were British ships guarding the American coastline for U-boats just offshore, but she had gone in underwater to the advantage of the submarine. And when she surfaced, American boats and even an American submarine helped guide her up Chesapeake Bay to the port of Baltimore. There was a heavy German-American population in Baltimore. When the sub put in at the dock, the band turned out and gave them a hero's welcome. So they were not only allowed to be feted by the mayor of Baltimore, but many of the people of Baltimore, being German-American, asked for news from home. And in the hold of the submarine were not only trade goods, but letters from next of kin, because 2.5 million Americans at the time of World War I were German-born, foreign-born Americans from Germany. And so the sub had chemical dyes, it had jewels, and these things were traded for American tin and nickel and other alloys to be used to manufacture weapons of war. The sub, after a few days, blithely sailed out of Chesapeake Bay and went all the way back to Bremen, Germany, her home port. So again, there was outrage, but America was technically neutral. However, the Germans could be very insidious. Americans, because of their geography and the fact that 50 million of the 92 million American people had British and or Canadian roots, kind of swung their sympathy toward the British and the French. The British were low on ammunition, so we were stockpiling ammunition for them at Black Tom Island, named after an African-American slave in New York Harbor. The Germans, using cigar bombs, planted them in a couple of places, one on Black Tom Island itself, one on an ammo barge just off the island, and in the early morning hours of Sunday, July 30th, 1916, there were a couple of big booms. Every window within half a mile was knocked out. The arm of the Statue of Liberty swung down slightly, was crippled. This was German sabotage, pure and simple. The Germans had organized a well-trained group of saboteurs to go ashore. One or two were even workers on Black Tom Island, but nobody thought the better of them. And so we think of 9/11 today, but America had Black Tom Island back in 1916. Fortunately, only 7 people perished because it was around 2 a.m. when the bombs went off, and it was a Sunday morning. It was not during maximum work shifts. So at any rate, this is the kind of thing that happened in America. There were over 100 mysterious fires and explosions in American munitions plants across the country, many of them, though, on the eastern seaboard, where merchant ships would leave for Great Britain with their holds filled with ammunition. The other side of the coin was this, though. Many German Americans were faithful citizens. There was Paul Prager, who was a coal miner in Illinois. And some dynamite was missing one day, and they thought maybe he had stole the blasting dynamite to open up deeper coal seams, and was a German saboteur. So his fellow miners took him out in the streets, dragged him around, and then hanged him from a tree. And his last requests were 2 things: to be wrapped in an American flag when he was buried, and to write a letter home to his next of kin, which he wrote in fluent German. That done, he was executed, but there's never been any proof to show that he was a saboteur or a terrorist. So that's the other side of the coin, which I think rings all too familiar today. And of course, dear old Woodrow Wilson, when he was reelected in 1916, his winning motto was, "He kept us out of war." The problem was that in early 1917, on February the 1st, the Germans decided to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. For a while, Wilson's outrage had prevailed in the Germans making a pledge that they would not torpedo large ocean liners, and they would not even go after merchant ships unless the subsurfaced, made its presence known, boarded the ship, checked its manifest to see if it had any war goods, and even if it did sink the ship after it determined that it did have war goods, it was supposed to provide life rafts for the entire crew of the ship. Well, that happened a few times, but it was impractical because the raison d'etre of undersea submarine warfare is that you don't know where the sub is. That's its element of surprise. And they were bending over double backwards for Mr. Wilson in the White House to accommodate him because they didn't want hundreds of thousands of American soldiers over in the Western Front, but unfortunately, that's what they got anyway. April 2nd, 1917, Wilson asked the Congress for a declaration of war in order to make the world safe for democracy, a line that we still hear from the White House nowadays. The voting was 80 yeses in the US Senate against 6 noes in the Senate. There were 6 Republican senators in the Senate who felt that it was a sort of a conspiracy of American manufacturers and financiers, and so that's why they voted no. In the House of Representatives, 353 voted yes, 50 voted no. So again, there was some opposition in the House. The first female American congresswoman, Jeanette Rankin, German-American, from Montana, voted no. With a sob, she said that they can't send women over to fight, therefore I will vote no because I don't feel, therefore, that we should send any men over to fight in the European war. So this was the kind of thing that was prevalent back in America at that time, even though it had entered the war to end all wars. Jane Addams was an anti-war opponent who had a women's peace society, and she campaigned to have a national referendum on the votes in the Senate and in the Congress. Let's see what we, the people, think, not what a select group of congressmen or US senators think about this. It got nowhere. She was invited to the White House. She spoke with President Wilson very politely, but that was the end of the attempt to do a sort of a recall on America's entry into the war. This was a brand new thing for America to go overseas and fight in a major European conflict. There was also war opposition against the war from, of all places, former Indian Territory, which became Oklahoma State in 1907. These poor dirt farmers that grew corn were getting squeezed by the banks. They didn't even own their own farmland. Many were young families, 20, 30, 35 years of age. And about 1,000 of them decided, we're going to band together and we're going to rebel. We're going to march from Pontotoc County in south central Oklahoma all the way to the White House, and we're going to eject Slick Wilson out of there. And a couple of deputy sheriffs were sent out to investigate. One was wounded by one of the Green Corn rebels. Now, the reason Green Corn enters the phraseology of that time is because there were the so-called 5 civilized tribes, and a band of the tribes had a green corn ceremony that took place late July, early August of every year, when the corn was starting to grow and it started to produce corn kernels. The kernels weren't quite yellow or white yet, they were still green. But the ceremony symbolized the breath of the spirit of life in the rebirth of nourishment for all humankind. And so the idea was the green corn rebels were going to eat green corn all the way from Oklahoma to Washington, D.C. on their march. But they never got too far because the townspeople got posses together that were armed, and they scattered the green corn rebels, and they were sort of spread to the 4 winds, so to speak. 450 were actually arrested out of about 1,000. 150 were sentenced to prison, and in the 1920s, there were still about 10 of them serving penitentiary terms. Because in June 1917, Woodrow Wilson saw to it that the Espionage Act was passed, and it wasn't just for spying. If you said women in America were nothing but brewed sows to produce young men to be soldiers, and then when they were killed to be fertilizer, you could get 2 years in prison, which is what happened to Kate O'Hare when she said that exact thing. So there were spies everywhere, but there was also propaganda to come on, enlist, and at the same time, why not shell out a few bucks to buy Liberty bonds to finance the war for your country? And so this poster attests to the dual purpose of this strain of propaganda, that there were 4 million doughboys, as they were called. Doughboys comes from this. In the old army, when you had horse cavalry and horse-drawn artillery, and you had the foot-slogging masses behind, cavalry was first, horse artillery second, and the infantry last. The infantry got all this powdery dust caked all over them, and it looked like they had been in a windstorm that had dough. And so they were known as doughboys. And at first it was derisive, but it became an honorary term, and many American men wanted to be a doughboy. 1 million voluntarily enlisted. 3 million were conscripted, but that still is a high enlistment rate. However, of the 1 million who enlisted, only 4,000 enlistees were African American. They felt they had gotten the short end of the American stick, so why should they volunteer to fight in a white man's war? And W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the great black reformers in America at the time, said that World War I was nothing but a war of the lighter races versus the darker races, in his opinion. And now, the idea was you would either work or fight. Men many men went to fight. So you had to fill a man's job at home so he could fill a soldier's job overseas. And because America was just becoming an industrialized nation at the time, women took up the plow and men took up the gun overseas. And so we have what was known as a farmerette. There were thousands. I don't know, I've never come across any statistics that indicated how many of these farmerettes there were on the Great Plains and other places in America, but there were a whole lot of them because no American doughboy ever went short on food rations. And we had so much that some of them spilled over to the British and French, who are our buddies, in the trenches. So that was part of the American women's contribution, but not the only part. You had these Black Tom Island explosions, but that didn't stop women from the thousands enlisting in working in munitions factories, even though a bomb or a shell could explode and wipe out the whole floor in the section of a large factory. 1 million American women were trolley car conductors. They were railroads, steam engine repair women. In fact, workers' overalls were renamed womanalls because so many women wore these kinds of fatigue clothes in keeping everything running while the boys were over there and the women over here. Now, the British and French not only cried, we need men, men, men from America, we're being bled white by the Germans, but then they said, we need ships, ships, ships. Well, the U.S. had a shipbuilding program before World War I, but it was devoted to battleships. They realized we can't have battleships to fight submarines. They're too slow, they don't carry depth charges, they don't have sonar gear, so destroyers became the new capital ship of the surface seas, and it dethroned the battleship. And this was the USS Ward. She was built at Mare Island. Her keel was laid and her superstructure done in less than 30 days. And the motto at Mare Island, and it spread to every shipyard in the United States, was "She's some baby." They were four-stack destroyers known as four-pipers. Why? Because you've got to get to a submarine fast. When you see a periscope, you don't wait around to see a torpedo trace or wake in the water. And the Germans were so impressed by these destroyers escorting convoys, which is an American concept, not a British one, that they didn't even try to attack the convoys. Not one American troop ship from May 1917 to November 1918 was sunk by a Dastard U-boat because of our good old American destroyers out there on the high seas. Now, the big wheels had to meet. The French commander, Marshal Ferdinand Foch, who was in charge of not only the French but the British armies, met for the first time in the summer of 1917 with the American commander, General John J. Blackjack Pershing. He was Blackjack to his cadets at West Point because he commanded the 10th Buffalo Soldier Cavalry. And they were on the Great Plains in the late 1800s, and they were superb soldiers, and Pershing was proud of each and every one of them. And he also led a punitive expedition into northern Mexico, 300 miles deep, to try to find Pancho Villa, who had gone across the border into New Mexico State and killed several innocent American civilians at Columbus, New Mexico. Here was the sticking point between the two iron commanders, Foch and Pershing. Foch said, don't train your troops, don't even bother to equip them, just put them in uniforms, get them over on troop ships, and they will be piecemealed into the French and British armies. Pershing said, nothing doing, Marshal Foch. I am going to have an independent, self-contained American army of 500,000 or more men on the Western Front, shoulder to shoulder with the British and French armies. Foch replied, then, if you do not accede to my demand, I will give up Pershing and let the Boche, I will give up Paris and let the Boche have it. Pershing said, go ahead. And so he said, Mon Dieu, I cannot get past this man. And so Pershing got his way for a self-contained doughboy army in France in the hundreds of thousands. And here is a photo of doughboys going over the top. The helmets were made in Britain. The backpacks may have been American. The rifles may have been American, British, or French. American manufacturing for war products was still gearing up throughout most of the rest of the conflict, in which the Americans were only present for 19 months. But they went over the top just as much as their allies did. America, incidentally, was not considered to be an allied nation. It was an associate nation because when President Wilson made his April 2nd, 1917 war pitch to the Senate and the Congress in joint session, he said, we want a peace without victory. We are not in it for the spoils of war. We want a war to end all wars. This was perhaps one of the most heroic Americans and well known in American folklore. Sergeant Alvin York, he was a member of the Christian Union Church in eastern mountainous rural Tennessee. He applied to be a conscientious objector but was turned down. They didn't know what to do with him. On the firing line, he was an expert because his dad had told him how to shoot a turkey through the eyeball at 60 yards distant with a gun or with a rifle that didn't have a telescopic sight. And so anyway, he decided maybe the way to look at it is to rationalize that if I kill an enemy soldier, a German, I'm helping to save the lives of my fellow Christian soldiers in the American Army. And so that's what he did. And on October the 2nd, 1918, he and a patrol ventured out, and there were some Germans out there. They made contact, and there was rifle fire. He killed about 26 Germans, but the members of his patrol were also wounded. York went on ahead a little ways. He found a German officer, he held a gun on him, and used the German officer as a shield and got 132 other Germans to surrender to him. The Germans were militia troops. They were not frontline soldiers, but the legend of Sergeant York spread throughout the American Army and the world, and he was given the Medal of Honor, and after the war, when he went home, the state of Tennessee gave him 400 acres of farming land. Unfortunately, York tangled with the IRS in later years, and with their usual sensitivity, they managed to sue him anyway after his heroic efforts. Now, African American doughboys, there were 350,000 mostly conscripted African Americans in the American Army. However, they were kept in segregated units as they had been in the war between the states. The majority of white people in America didn't like the thought of integrating blacks with whites. And so there were several regiments of black infantry that Pershing graciously passed over to Marshal Foch as a kind of compromise. And they fought very well. In fact, they got 171 Croix de Guerre. That was the French equivalent of a Great War Medal. The Americans issued a top secret report from the American High Command to the French saying, don't give any more of these Croix de Guerre, so get uppity, and then we'll have a big race war when we get home. They'll be like strutting German soldiers, only they'll be strutting African American doughboys at home with rifles. We can't have this. But they performed admirably. Most of them actually were stevedores in the major French ports that took on supplies as well as American doughboys, and did a great job in that particular capacity. But integration would not occur until the Korean War. Now, the American Indians. There were 13,000 American Indians who were in the service. They didn't know quite how to induct them because American Indians on reservation land were not on United States property. So they weren't born as American citizens. They were not given the right to vote as American citizens. It was left to the local draft boards. Some draft boards felt they were, some felt they weren't. So about 6,000 were drafted and about 6,500 volunteered. And they had a special language advantage. The Germans did not know dialects of American Indian languages, such as Choctaw, for example. They got 14 Choctaw American Indians into a special code unit, and they would relay messages from the trenches back to the higher command some 50 miles away, and the Germans didn't know what to make of it. And even if a code talker accidentally used some verbiage in English, it might have been hard for the Germans to figure out just what it meant. For example, 3 grains of corn meant the 3rd Battalion. Bad air was poison gas. Scalps were casualties. The Germans probably wouldn't have known what those things meant, but they were invaluable in keeping the enemy unaware of tactical plans on the front. And history, of course, is cyclical. Marcelino Serna was an illegal, undocumented alien, a sugar beet farmer in Denver, Colorado. The feds were about to get him and deport him. And all of a sudden he said, I want to join the American Army. Join him he did, and he went overseas, captured a German machine gun nest single-handedly, and got the Distinguished Service Cross and several other decorations. When he went back home, he was the most decorated Hispanic American doughboy in World War I. And a very handsome fellow. It almost looks like a 1930s Hollywood movie picture or something, more than it does his little. But he became a plumber at a hospital, and